August 31, 1943. Marcus Island. Lieutenant Commander Charles W. Brewer, commanding Fighting Squadron 5, VF-5, from the USS Yorktown, banked his new Grumman F-6F Hellcat, the heavy fighter feeling surprisingly nimble beneath him. Ahead, the tiny Japanese outpost, barely a speck in the vast Pacific, braced for the inevitable. Below, the flak began to blossom, black puffs against the azure, but Brewer's thoughts were elsewhere, specifically on the strange reports filtering back from the squadrons that had encountered the Zero. The enemy's primary fighter, the Mitsubishi A-6M, was a Phantom, fast, incredibly maneuverable, and, crucially, lightly armed, and almost completely devoid of armor. It had carved a legend across the Pacific, swatting down Allied planes with terrifying ease in the war's early days. The Hellcat, by contrast, was a brute. Heavy, robust, and designed for speed and durability, not balletic dogfighting. Japanese propaganda echoing the sentiments of their pilots had already begun to mock the F-6F as a flying tank, a slow, clumsy beast that would fall prey to the Zero's grace. It was a perception born of genuine experience against earlier, less capable American aircraft, and it was a perception that would soon become a terrible, fatal irony for the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. The first encounters had been inconclusive, but as more Hellcats arrived, and as American pilots began to understand the strengths of their new mount, the dynamic of the air war was about to invert, brutally and decisively. The pilots of the Yorktown and other carriers were not just flying new machines. They were flying the embodiment of an industrial might that the Japanese simply could not comprehend, let alone counter. The raw material pouring into American factories, the sheer number of skilled laborers, the innovative design processes, all of it coalesced into aircraft like the Hellcat, which, for all its perceived clumsiness, carried a secret weapon far more potent than its 6.50 caliber machine guns, expendability, and a relentless, overwhelming numerical superiority. For every Hellcat that fell, 5 more were already rolling off the assembly lines, a grim mathematical equation that would shatter the deeply ingrained, almost spiritual belief in Japanese pilots' inherent superiority. The Zero's reign was built on a foundation of early war design philosophy that prioritized extreme maneuverability and range over protection. This made it a deadly opponent for the P-40 Warhawks and F-4F Wildcats it first encountered. But the tide began to turn with the arrival of the Hellcat. The F-6F was conceived in the crucible of combat lessons, learned from the Wildcat's limitations. It was designed from the outset to be a Zero killer. Engineers at Grumman literally interrogated returning Wildcat pilots, asking them what they needed in a new fighter. The answer was almost universally more power, more armor, more ammunition, and the ability to dive without tearing its wings off. The Hellcat delivered on all fronts. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, a marvel of American engineering, provided over 2,000 horsepower, pushing the F-6F to speeds over 380 miles per hour. Its robust airframe could absorb immense battle damage, a stark contrast to the Zero's fragile construction, and its 6 Browning AN/M 2.50 caliber machine guns, mounted in the wings, could unleash a devastating torrent of lead, 750 rounds per minute per gun, for a total of 4,500 rounds per minute. This was not a subtle weapon. It was a blunt instrument of destruction, designed to obliterate anything it hit. The Japanese pilots initially dismissed these attributes. Their experience had taught them that a superior pilot in a more agile aircraft could always outmaneuver and defeat a heavier, less nimble opponent. This belief was not entirely unfounded. It had served them well. But the Hellcat changed the rules of engagement. It didn't need to outmaneuver the Zero in a turning fight, a maneuver that American pilots were explicitly trained to avoid. Instead, it used its superior speed and diving capability to perform boom and zoom attacks, streaking down from above, unleashing a burst, and then climbing away to repeat the process. This tactic negated the Zero's primary advantage. The Hellcat was not designed to fight the Zero on its own terms, but to dictate an entirely new set of terms. The early encounters, while sparse, offered glimpses of what was to come. At the Battle of Marcus Island, Brewer and his VF-5 squadron, along with VF-1 from the USS Bunker Hill, engaged a force of 40 Japanese Zeros and Bettys. It was one of the Hellcat's operational debuts. The Americans claimed 13 Zeros shot down for the loss of 1 F-6F. The statistics were compelling, but the true picture would emerge as more Hellcats deployed. By November 1943, during the battles for Bougainville and the first major carrier battle for Rabaul, the Hellcat truly began to make its presence felt. Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, a veteran of hundreds of dogfights, recorded in his memoirs the shock of encountering the new American fighter. He described how the Hellcat, which he initially considered a poor design, was suddenly everywhere, flown by increasingly aggressive and well-trained American pilots. The cognitive dissonance for Japanese airmen must have been profound. Everything they had been taught, everything they had experienced, pointed to their inherent superiority. Their Zeros were lighter, faster in a turn, and handled like extensions of their own bodies. Yet these flying tanks were proving deadly. The very robustness that Japanese pilots mocked allowed the Hellcat to sustain damage that would cripple a Zero and still return to its carrier. The sheer volume of fire from 6.50 caliber machine guns meant that even a brief burst could tear a Zero apart, often exploding its fuel tanks or severing control surfaces. The contrast between the two philosophies of aircraft design was stark. The Zero, an elegant but fragile instrument; the Hellcat, a brutal, forgiving war machine. This wasn't just a technological mismatch. It was a clash of industrial capacities. The average time to build a Zero took significantly more man-hours than a Hellcat, despite its simpler appearance, due to less efficient manufacturing processes. As 1944 dawned, the situation became catastrophic for the Japanese. The Mariana and Palau Islands campaign, culminating in the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, would become known to American pilots as the Great Mariana Turkey Shoot. This was the moment the Hellcat asserted its absolute dominance. On June 19, 1944, wave after wave of Japanese aircraft, comprising Zeros, Judys, Kates, and other types, launched from Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carriers, intent on destroying the American fleet. What they encountered was a wall of Hellcats. The U.S. Navy had 15 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers in the area, deploying nearly 900 Hellcats. Ozawa, by contrast, had 5 fleet carriers and 4 light carriers, with fewer than 500 aircraft, many of which were outdated or flown by inexperienced pilots. The aerial engagements that day were a slaughter. American pilots, using their superior radar control and the Hellcat's formidable capabilities, decimated the Japanese formations. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, flying an F-6F from USS Lexington, shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in a single engagement that day, an astonishing feat. The Japanese formations were broken, their planes exploding in midair, raining down into the Pacific. By the end of the day, over 300 Japanese aircraft had been shot down, with minimal American losses. The Hellcat had proved not merely superior, but overwhelmingly so. The Turkey Shoot was not just a battle. It was a statistical referendum on the two air forces. Japan had lost an irreplaceable number of aircraft and, more critically, experienced pilots. The Hellcat had not only debunked the myth of the Zero's invincibility, but had effectively gutted the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, an organization that, from this point forward, would never recover its pre-war strength or proficiency. The industrial numbers behind this dominance are staggering and often overlooked in the dramatic narratives of air combat. While a Japanese pilot might spend countless hours perfecting their craft, believing individual skill could overcome any odds, the American war machine was operating on an entirely different scale. In 1943 alone, Grumman produced 2,855 Hellcats. In 1944, that number surged to an incredible 6,664. Compare this to the Mitsubishi A6M0. Throughout its entire production run, from 1940 to 1945, approximately 10,939 Zeros were built. In 1943, peak Zero production was around 2,000 aircraft. In 1944, it dropped to around 1,300. This meant that by the time the Hellcat was fully deployed, American factories were producing more Hellcats in a single year than the Japanese were producing Zeros. The numerical superiority was not incremental, it was exponential. It wasn't just fighters either. The entire American industrial base was geared for war, producing everything from battleships to bullets at an astonishing rate. The U.S. economy had shifted from civilian production to military production with unprecedented speed and efficiency, a feat that astounded Allied and Axis observers alike. This relentless output meant that even if a Hellcat was lost, another was ready to take its place almost immediately. The Japanese, with their smaller industrial base and reliance on often scarce raw materials, could simply not keep pace. Their pilots were a finite resource, their aircraft even more so. Each Zero lost was a significant blow. Each Hellcat lost was a momentary inconvenience in the grand scheme of American production. This was the true silent killer of the Japanese Air Force. Not just the Hellcat's guns, but the factories that churned them out. Moreover, the American pilot training pipeline was a well-oiled machine, capable of producing competent, if not yet ace, pilots in vast numbers. While the Japanese began the war with a corps of highly experienced, pre-war trained pilots, their attrition rate was unsustainable. They simply could not replace their losses fast enough. As their veteran pilots were killed, they were replaced by increasingly green recruits, often with as little as 150 hours of flight time, thrown into combat against seasoned American aviators flying superior aircraft. Many of these young Japanese pilots were sent into battle, with barely enough training to land on a carrier, let alone survive a dogfight against an F-6F. The result was predictable, even more devastating losses. The disparity in training, coupled with the Hellcat's advantages, created a death spiral for the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. A veteran Japanese pilot, reflecting on the later stages of the war, once remarked, "We were fighting ghosts. They kept coming, no matter how many we shot down." The ghost wasn't just the Hellcat, but the industrial and human capacity that stood behind it. The American strategy, whether consciously or not, had become one of attrition, a numbers game that Japan was doomed to lose from the outset. The Hellcat was merely the most visible and deadly manifestation of this strategy in the air. The Hellcat finished the war with an astonishing kill-to-loss ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. It was officially credited with 5,163 kills, more than any other Allied naval aircraft. While the precise numbers are always subject to historical debate and methodology, the overall picture is undeniable. The F-6F Hellcat was the dominant naval fighter of the Pacific War. It flew from the decks of America's rapidly expanding carrier fleet, providing air superiority that allowed the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to advance island by island across the vast Pacific. It protected bombers, engaged enemy shipping, and most importantly, swept the skies clean of Japanese opposition. The very characteristics that Japanese pilots initially scoffed at, its robustness, its heavy armament, its powerful engine, were precisely what made it so deadly. It was built for efficiency, for survivability, for the brutal reality of total war. It didn't need to be graceful. It needed to kill, and it did so with devastating effectiveness. The mocking epithets of flying tank and pig plane quickly evaporated in the face of overwhelming losses. Instead, a grim respect, tinged with despair, began to settle upon the remaining Japanese aviators. The myth of the invincible Zero, so carefully cultivated by propaganda and early victories, was shattered, replaced by the grim reality of an enemy that could simply outproduce, outpower, and ultimately overwhelm. The F-6F Hellcat story isn't just one of technological superiority, but of profound cultural and industrial contrasts. The Japanese war effort, while fiercely determined and often characterized by incredible individual bravery, was ultimately undone by a lack of resources, an inflexible command structure, and an industrial base that could not compete with that of the United States. Their initial successes fostered a belief in spiritual power and individual skill, triumphing over material odds, a belief that the Hellcat systematically dismantled, one downed zero at a time. The American approach, pragmatic and focused on mass production and iterative design, proved to be the more effective strategy in a global conflict that ultimately became a war of industrial capacity. The Hellcat became the symbol of this shift in power, a heavy, unglamorous workhorse that nonetheless performed its duties with ruthless efficiency. It reflected a society capable of immense, coordinated effort, a society that could transform raw materials into an unstoppable torrent of war material. The Japanese pilots, who had once soared unchallenged, found themselves confronted not just by an aircraft, but by an entire nation's manufacturing might, all channeled into the blunt, undeniable force of the Hellcat. By the end of the war, the skies over the Pacific were largely devoid of Japanese aircraft. Those that remained were often relics, or flown by pilots with barely any training, their fuel tanks nearly empty. The once proud Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service had been systematically annihilated. The Hellcat, along with the equally formidable F-4U Corsair, had ensured American air superiority was absolute. This air superiority was critical to the success of every subsequent Allied operation, from amphibious landings to strategic bombing campaigns. The heavy fighter, once mocked for its bulk, had proven to be the most agile and adaptable weapon in the arsenal of naval aviation. Its legacy is not just in the numbers of enemy planes it destroyed, but in the paradigm shift it represented, the triumph of industrial capacity and pragmatic design over an ideology that prioritized lightness and maneuverability at the cost of pilot protection and durability. The enduring image of the Hellcat is one of a relentless, powerful machine, a true embodiment of the phrase, "form follows function," achieving its purpose with a deadly matter-of-fact precision that utterly transformed the face of aerial combat in the Pacific. It was the ultimate, inescapable answer to the Zero's challenge, and it sealed the fate of the Imperial Japanese Navy in the skies. It's a quiet afternoon, perhaps on a carrier deck somewhere off Iwo Jima, early 1945. A young American mechanic, barely out of high school, wipes oil from the cowling of an F-6F Hellcat. The plane is scarred, patched, and worn, a testament to countless combat missions. He doesn't know the name of the pilot who flew it, but he knows the sound of its engines, the smell of aviation fuel, the feel of its rivets. He's just a cog in the machine, one of thousands who kept these formidable aircraft in the air. Yet, without him, without the factories that built the Hellcat and the engines, without the thousands of anonymous hands that sourced the raw materials and assembled the components, none of it would have been possible. The dramatic dogfights, the heroic pilots, the stunning victories, all rested on a foundation of mundane, relentless industrial output. The Japanese, in their fatal underestimation of American ingenuity in production, failed to grasp this fundamental truth. They saw an airplane, a machine, but they didn't see the entire system, the vast network of human and material resources that birthed that machine and sustained its operations. This disconnect, this inability to comprehend the sheer scale of American power, was as much a factor in their defeat as any individual bullet or burst of machine gun fire. The Hellcat was not just a fighter. It was a physical manifestation of a nation's industrial will, a will that proved ultimately unstoppable. The final irony, perhaps, is that the Zero, for all its initial brilliance and legend, became obsolete almost as quickly as it had emerged. Its design, rooted in a pre-war vision of aerial combat, could not adapt to the rapidly evolving realities of industrial warfare. The Hellcat, on the other hand, was born from those very realities. It was a fighter designed for the war it was actually fighting, not the war that had been imagined years before. It was heavier because armor saved lives. It was faster in a dive because energy tactics were more effective than turning circles. It was heavily armed because more bullets meant more kills. The pilots who flew them, often trained in relatively short courses, quickly became proficient in leveraging these advantages. They didn't need to be samurai of the sky. They needed to be effective marksmen and tacticians. The Hellcat empowered them to be just that. The transformation of the Pacific Air War, from a contest where Japanese pilots held a decisive edge to one where American superiority was absolute, is one of the most stark and dramatic shifts in military history. And at the heart of that transformation was the flying tank, the clumsy brute, the F-6F Hellcat, soaring across the vast blue, relentlessly sending its once feared adversaries crashing into the waves below, a silent, powerful testament to overwhelming force.